Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. In the previous lecture, we started our discussion with the understanding that how the concept of interpretation is related to the concept of foregrounding. Because if foregrounding is the unusual way a writer presents an idea and wants to enhance or magnify some object or feeling through the writing, then we must interpret it. We must give meaning to it, because this is not something communicated to us openly or in simple words. When the words are unusual, different, it enhances the difficulty of the understanding of those objects. That is why we need to interpret those ideas. Now, what is meant by interpretation, and what is its relationship with foregrounding, and how important it is for the study of stylistics, is what is our concern today. Interpretation is the process of understanding, deciphering, and giving meaning to those things which appear ambiguous, strange, and unusual. And there are many ambiguities in the text as well, in the literary writing as well. The literary writing may have a surface meaning, a metaphoric meaning, a symbolic meaning, or between the lines meanings. And that complexity is enhanced because of the use of devices, stylistic features, elements, and foregrounding and deviation. So that is why we need to take the help of the process of interpretation to understand the meaning of the literary writing, to give the messages a purpose, or to decide and decipher their meanings. And we also want to understand the implication of a text. The implication, what does the text refer to? Maybe a writer might have said something in a sort of, you can say, very strange way to avoid criticism, or to avoid censure, or to avoid the feeling that somebody might get offended. So if we have to decipher such intentions which might be sarcastic, ironic, critical, political, and that purpose of a text makes the reader understand the importance of foregrounding and its use or dependence upon interpretation for the sake of understanding the meanings and the messages of poems. We decide that a text needs close attention, because literary discourse is different from ordinary discourse on the basis of the images, symbols, on the basis of the literary devices and techniques which the writers employ in the text. And then the difficulty is enhanced because poetic language is more compact and it is brief. So where the writer is not giving long and detailed explanations, rather he is restricting his expression to a few words. So the expression restricted to a few words, and then expression given through the use of a symbol or a metaphor, makes the task of a reader difficult, because the reader has no clue of long explanation, details, and descriptions or simple language. He encounters complex language that is filled and packed with meaning, that is ambiguous, and that is very much unusual. So that is why these demands that a literary piece makes on part of the reader, they enhance the feeling that any piece of writing which is making use of foregrounding, which is deviant, strange, unusual from ordinary discourse, it has to be interpreted. It has to be deciphered as far as its messages, meanings, and its significance is concerned. Critics say that whenever a writer makes use of a foregrounded feature in a writing, a question mark accompanies each feature. A question mark accompanies each feature means that we as a reader, while we read a text, a question arises in our mind that why is it so? Why this image? Why this symbol? Why not something else? And then how is it related to the way a writer has composed this poem? So when a question mark accompanies all the features that are the foregrounded features in any text. We ask ourselves as a reader or as an analyst that what is the point? What is the point or the idea that the writer wishes to convey through this symbol or image? For example, what is the meaning of the word ivory that is used in Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness? For example, when we read Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, we come across repeatedly the symbol of ivory. As Conrad says that Marlowe, when enters into Africa, finds that the word ivory rang in the air. It was whispered, it was sighed. Now, we really feel that it brings questions in our mind that what is the meaning of the word ivory in the novel? In which particular context has it been used? What does it symbolize? Why ivory is the object that the writer has preferred, and what are the associations made to that object or symbol? So, this is how a question mark accompanies each foregrounded feature. If ivory as a symbol is a foregrounded feature in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, then the questions that we as a reader or analyst ask ourselves is that what is the meaning of the word ivory? Is it just the tusks of the elephants, that is the white bones? Or is it the metaphor or a symbol for something that extends its meaning beyond its material significance as an object or as a piece of bone? We understand through our reading and analysis with the help of the interpretation. With the help of the skill of interpretation, we reach to the meaning of the word ivory, the symbol ivory, that it stands for lust and greed of the Europeans. It stands for materialism. It stands for glitter and gold. That is what the world reflects. It is the devil's worship, as it is the bone, having no spirit or flesh. This is what the modern man has become, the Europeans have become. In their lust and greeds, they have been following the devil. They have been following the material or the body or the bone. So, this is how we understand the meaning of the images, because we interpret it. And for interpretation, the basic thing is that we ask questions. Why is it so? Then, what does the writer want to convey through this particular feature? Is the very theme or the essence of a work. The theme or the essence or the vital message of a work is always hidden within those symbols and images that are the foregrounded features or irregularities that are being used by the writer. When we say that a question mark accompanies each feature, we say that we cannot overlook these features. We have to stop, think, reflect, and make associations. Recall our previous understanding, and then put that previous understanding and knowledge into the context of the present work's study. And we have to see that the writer has made unconsciously or consciously certain associations, and we ask, what is the point? Either we are reading for pleasure, we keep asking questions because we are evaluating a text. So this evaluation is interpretation. Either we are reading the text as for the sake of pleasure reading, or for the sake of examination, or for the sake of literary analysis like a literary critic or a stylistician. This exercise of evaluation and interpretation keeps going on, either consciously or unconsciously, because we are trying to relate the images or the foregrounded features with what we know and with what we are getting to know through our reading of the texts. For example, recall to your mind any piece of writing. For example, here I can recall Virginia Woolf's novel, that is Mrs. Dalloway, in which she makes use of the image or the symbol of a knife. In Virginia Woolf's famous novel, Mrs. Dalloway, that is a stream of consciousness 20th century novel, Mrs. Dalloway's friend Peter comes to meet her, and whenever he comes to meet Mrs. Dalloway, he sits with a feeling of agitation or a little, you can say, uneasiness, and in that emotion he picks up a knife, a pocket knife from his coat's pocket, and keeps on opening and closing it repeatedly, pressing the button. That is, automatically something that comes out of the pocket. Now that is a repeated symbol that whenever Mrs. Dalloway would meet her friend Peter, Peter would take out a knife and keep pressing the button so that he seems to be playing with that knife. Now, as a reader or as a stylistician, we cannot overlook that symbol. What does the knife symbolize? This has to be interpreted, because knife and the activity of taking it out of the pocket, playing with it, closing it and opening it, is significant. Why is it so? Why is it being used? Is a particular deliberate design of the author that is a foregrounded feature. Now, as a reader, if we are to interpret it, we assign many meanings to it. For example, it reveals a sign of his emotional state, that he is unstable, he's suppressing his emotions. He could not say to Dalloway what he wanted to, he could not express his feelings, he could not really give expression to his thoughts, emotions, love, for example. So that is why his suppressed emotions and his feeling of anger and aggression or love or emotion, when it is kept within himself, that is what is given expression to when he takes out the knife and pushes it in and out. So that feeling of suppression of emotions is conveyed through the symbol of a knife that is sharp, that can be used for cutting. Now, how sharp, how painful, how hurting can be the emotions which are suppressed, which are not given vent to. So these are the associations that we make with the help of interpretation of that image of a knife. Another example can be from the play, that is by Harold Pinter, The Caretaker. In Caretaker, Harold Pinter had made use of a symbol that is the empty bucket. An empty bucket is lying there on the stage where the characters move. The rest of the place is also chaotic and looks like junk. But an empty bucket is put under a place from where the roof seems to be broken, and the rainwater seems to drop in that bucket occasionally. Now that drip drop of the rain into that empty bucket that never seems to be filled is a reference to the very life that the characters lead. These characters are also like empty bucket. They are hollow spiritually or morally or lacking ambition. They need to be filled with a feeling of either fulfillment, gratification, or anything that would give meaning to their lives. So these images have been interpreted on the basis of what the rest of the text talks about. We give meaning to the activity of taking a knife out of pocket and playing with it with the help of how Peter and Mrs. Dalloway's relationship has progressed. We found that there were certain problems that occurred in their relationship. That is why we associate it not subjectively but quite objectively with the fact that it is the expression of suppressed emotions. Similarly, in the analysis or interpretation of the symbol of empty bucket that occurs in Pinter's Caretaker, we look at it from the perspective that the lives of the characters are also hollow. They are not doing anything. They are idle men. They are waiting for help that would come from up there, from God, just like a bucket needs to be filled in by the rainwater that would be from heaven. These characters also are waiting for some heavenly intervention in their lives, and they're not doing anything. Unless a divine help comes, they may not change their life. They are waiting for a miracle. So these interpretations of the symbols are not random. They're not based on the whims and wishes of the reader. we try to link these explanations or interpretations logically with the text, with the rest of the text. We associate it with how the scheme of the whole text, novel or play or poem has been created. What are the other recurrent images? And if another image is used, we interpret that image by associating that image with what has already been used in the text in the form of the other images, either of spirituality, spiritual barrenness, or of emotional you can say disturbances, which we have seen in both these examples. So that is how the subjectivity of interpretation is removed when you interpret one symbol by associating it with what are the other references that occur in the text. When one symbol is understood by the help of its connection with other associations and other symbols, we can remove the idea of subjectivity or the idea of personal thought that would be giving meaning to any image or symbol for the understanding of the interpretation or meaning of a text. Now that we have focused on the issue of interpretation and its association with the foregrounding from the very angle that interpretation should not be subjective. It should be objective. We should try to verify the analysis that we have reached to by associating it with other associations and other symbols and the images in the text. Now, critics in stylistics such as Widdowson and Jeffrey Leach say that interpretation too has to follow particular parameters or principles. Now, critics like Jeffrey Leach give 3 instances for interpretation, or they give 3 ways of interpretation, that there are 3 different ways possible for interpreting any text. We can either interpret it in one way or the other. Now, that is referred to as when is a linguistic deviation or a foregrounded feature rendered artistically significant. There might be many features in a text that are foregrounded. There might be many features in a text that appear unusual and deviant. But how and which of these features are to be selected and termed as significant deviations or foregrounding irregularities? According to Jeffrey Leach, the first way of interpreting something or the first way of recognizing the irregularity or the foregrounded irregularity is to notice what does it communicate. It operates at the level of the surface meaning. How does it hinder it or how does it enhance it? What changes and disruptions does it make use of when it has been done by an author? So the first instance of interpretation is when it communicates something. Observe these examples, which would make it clear that we, in our first way or first form of interpreting a text, focus on the purpose of communication. The first example states, "My son accompanied me through the journey." Now, in this example, we see that it should have been "my son." The spellings are wrong. S-O-N rather than S-U-N should have been used by the writer. If it had been "my son" with S-O-N, son, then we would understand that this is what it is communicating, because the speaker or the writer or a character is saying that her son or his son was accompanying him through the journey. But instead of son with O, here it is written with U. That complicates the thing. And we feel that this sentence wanted to communicate the person being accompanied by his son or his offspring, whereas the statement says that the person was accompanied by the son. That is not a relation or not the offspring of the character who is speaking over here. So here the communication is distorted. The purpose of the writer was, or the speaker was, to tell us that he was going somewhere with his son. But if we look at it from this perspective, that the writer might have intentionally used the word sun, then it would have been a literary perspective of looking at things, that he is looking at sun as maybe God or the divine presence that accompanied him when he was lonely on his journey. So look how interpretation makes us see that what does a sentence communicate. It makes sense on both the levels, whether it had been sun with S-O-N, sun, or whether it is sun with S-U-N, sun. The meaning doesn't make us reach to a wrong or a faulty understanding or the perspective of the interpretation. In both the cases, we would have reached to one meaning or the other, which is pertinent and useful for the understanding. Look at the second example for the sake of interpretation of what does it communicate. The morning comes to consciousness. Here, the word consciousness is misspelled. The word consciousness is written with wrong spellings and the letter U is missing. Now the reader feels as if it's a deviation, or maybe it's a spelling error, or maybe it's a typing error, or it's a proofreading. So it becomes a hindrance. So these sort of feelings may be about typing error or proofreading error. They are not regarded as literary deviations. Jeffrey Leach says that such instances of faulty expression, which is due to either spelling mistake or the mistake by the speakers, a lack of understanding of language, they are not literary deviations. So we have to distinguish it from the concept of foregrounding. But puns and metaphors and euphemisms, they do all come under the umbrella of the understanding of the foregrounding and the features of foregrounding as deviation. Look at the third example where the speaker or the writer is saying "me goes." Now that seems a very colloquial and very immature in expression. Instead of saying "I am going," here it is said "me goes." So that seems to be the expression of maybe a young boy who is trying to appear stylish, or who's trying to show that he is contemporary and he is trying to deviate from the standards of speech of the adults and says "me goes." So here grammar is faulty, which communicates about the age or the type of a person who speaks this statement, that he would not like to conform to the rules and he wants to stand out and deviate and rebel against the norms. So these abnormalities or differences in expression in these examples, they may be taken as errors initially, because these errors hinder the process of communication, because the writer did not mean to use the word sun. Rather, he wanted to refer to the son, that is the offspring. In the second line, the writer did not want to misspell the word consciousness. In the third line, maybe the speaker, due to his lack of the knowledge of grammar of English, makes use of a statement "me goes." So if these three interpretations are correct, that the spellings are incorrect and the grammar is incorrect, then these are all the hindrances in communication, and we must leave these hindrances out of the context and idea of foregrounding, because literary foregrounding is something more deeper than just hindrances in the expression or errors in the expression. Spelling mistakes, faulty grammar due to the lack of understanding and knowledge of the language, they cannot be interpreted from the point of view of a stylistician. So Jeffrey Leach asserts that when a mistake occurs in a text that is not deliberate, rather it's the fault of typing or proofreading, or maybe it is the lack of the knowledge of the grammar or the language, that is what would be excluded from interpretation from the point of view of understanding of foregrounding or literature. So we must keep in mind that literary foregrounding is something that is what lies beyond mistakes or literary blunders and errors. So we say that poets have poetic license, but this poetic license is to be granted on the basis of what does it aid to in a writing. How does it enhance the meaning of a writing? If it's an error, we leave it and we do not consider it as foregrounding. So, unintentionally, these words convey meaning, and just the way we see that if the writer instead of SU and sun has used SO and sun, the meanings would have changed. We looked at the metaphoric meaning that maybe he's referring to the fact that God is following him or is accompanying him in his lonely journey. But initially we thought that he has done a mistake, that instead of U, instead of O, he has made use of the letter U. So it shows to us that even the unintentional or even the writing that has made use of an error becomes interpretable for the reader. But for the sake of the interpretation of foregrounding from the perspective of stylistics, we exclude such trivial details or errors or hindrances or mistakes. We do not consider them worth interpretation. We do not consider them worth investigation. As we see the examples, these examples, if they are not mistakes, all these three examples, use of SU and sun instead of SO and sun, use of consciousness instead of consciousness, use of me goes instead of I am going, if they are deliberate and not mistakes, then what happens? If they are deliberate, we are supposed to see that they do convey a meaning. They do have a design and purpose. Now, what do we see about these examples if they are intentional? According to Jeffrey Leach, we are to consider that they might convey something about the education, the social status of a person who is speaking it. For example, if somebody says me goes, we interpret it or try to give meaning or justification to his expression and do not term it as faulty or as error. We may say that he is a young boy who is trying to appear cool. Maybe we say that he is not the native speaker of English, and since he is not the native speaker of English, he doesn't know the proper use of English grammar. That is why instead of saying I am going, he says me goes. So, but anything that is printing error, proofreading mistake, imperfect use of language by author, or may be done intentionally by the writer, or it can be something that he may be doing as maybe for the sake of comic effects, to make the writing appear humorous. He may make use of such blunders or mistakes which would appear to add to the flavor or the comicality of a text. So, me goes and sun instead of sun, and then consciousness instead of consciousness make us feel that the speaker within the poem or the novel is uneducated or ignorant, or is unable to express himself or herself in a proper way. So that would add to the comicality or humor if it is intentional and deliberately done by the author. So we have seen that this was the most trivial, most simple way of deviation which has been used, and in this interpretation we term it as something which is not complicated at all. So even the most trivial and unmotivated deviation may communicate something. So in these three examples we see that the act of communication did take place. Either it was my son with SO and son or SU and son. Both have been granted meaning in our interpretation. If it is consciousness or consciousness, we term it as maybe it is because of a linguistic blunder that has been committed by a speaker who did not have good command on the language English. And then the second example we termed that the speaker, who is a young person, in a way to appear cool and quite fashionable, is deviating from the regular grammatical expression. So everything becomes interpretable in literary writing. Due to the poetic license that the writers have, we do not call that they have committed a mistake. We say that they are making artistic use of language and foregrounding features. So if these features are foregrounded, they become the focal point and the focus of attention of the reader. And then the reader is supposed to interpret it. He has to interpret it if a writer has deliberately made use of such devices. Jeffrey Leach further states that in our understanding of the foregrounded features, we are to decipher when does a linguistic deviation becomes artistically significant. Now, in the first instance, the linguistic deviations were not artistically significant. They appeared quite superficial, like errors, blunders, mistakes, or revealing the lack of education and knowledge of the speaker. But a linguistic deviation, that is foreground feature or more literary feature, has to be artistically significant. It is when it communicates the intention of the author. According to Jeffrey Leach, any linguistic deviation or foregrounded feature is worth noticing and becomes important and interpretable when it is intentional, when it is deliberately done by the author. According to this definition, deviation is significant only when it is deliberate. Linguistic blunder or typing error may be termed as deviation by the reader because the reader doesn't know it was intentional or not. But since artistic deviation is always done deliberately, thoughtfully, and purposefully by the author, that is what demands foregrounding and interpretation. Now, since it is deliberate, it has been foregrounded and made prominent because the writer, with the deliberate thought, makes something strange, unusual, and striking feature of his text. And when it is deliberately made a striking feature of the text, the reader, when he would encounter it, he would stop over there and try to interpret why it is used, what does it mean, what does it stand for, what is its relationship to the text, and why something else hadn't been used instead of this feature. Imagine, for example, the same phrase, a grief ago. On your first look at this phrase, a grief ago, you may feel that the writer has made a mistake. We don't measure time with grief or happiness. We measure it with the yardstick of a month or a year or a century. So the writer has done something wrong, but you appreciate it because what you were comfortable with has been challenged. You say, how come a writer changes my perception and belief in something? And that is through the use of deviation, which becomes a foregrounded feature. Now, what meanings do you give to it through interpretation? How you as a reader justify and back up the writer's unconventional choice of a word or a phrase and its irregularity. You feel that time had become still for the speaker when he had been in a feeling of grief. So he had been under so many pressures and griefs that to him time is not measured through minutes, days, weeks and months. Rather, time was being measured when he was in pain and grief through the way a grief would stick to his heart. For the duration of grief, he would measure it with, his age and time. So that is how time replaces a mood or a feeling. That becomes the yardstick of measuring the age. So this deviation becomes artistically significant because it's not error, it's not the mistake of typing or the mistake of the speaker's lack of knowledge of the language of English. Rather, it is deliberately done by the author as something that should strike the reader, something that would become foreground irregularity, something that would be deviant from the norms of writing. But here, Jeffrey Leach states that any deviation is significant only when the author has deliberately made use of it. It would exclude linguistic blunders like malapropism or slip of tongues. It means that any slip of tongue is something unintentional, whereas linguistic deviation or foregrounding has to be deliberate and intentional. But the problem with this definition that Leach presents is that the intention of the author is unknown. No author describes to us why he used a particular symbol. What is the meaning of a particular metaphor? A manual doesn't accompany a writer's poem, or instructions aren't given there that how to read a poem. A glossary is not given along with the poem so that we might see in which particular meaning or context has the writer used a word. So, if this is the problem with the finding of the intention of the author, we say that now we have to rely on the evidence in the text. Now we have to rely on the knowledge that we have about the world, about the poet, about the art of creativity and poetry, if we are to interpret the foregrounded features and their meanings. For example, if a writer is alive, we cannot approach him to tell us what does he want to present through his characters, his images and symbols. For example, once in an interview, Harold Pinter, the celebrated author and dramatist who has written the many plays like Waiting for Godot, he was approached by the critics and he was asked that what meanings would you like to give to the setting that you arrange for your plays in your dramas. Then he said that he would not like to explain anything or give meaning to what he writes. He said that the reality of my plays lies in the reader's mind, and he doesn't want to give a single meaning to his writing that would confine its interpretation. So look, this is what a writer's intention is. The writer just throws something in the field. Who would look at it in which particular way is not what the writer decides. It is what the readers decide. So that is the charm, that is the real, taste of interpretation. That any feature that lies there as deviant, unusual, strange, and worth noticing lies there for the reader to give it a meaning and to give it an understanding. And that is why if the writer's intentions are inaccessible, the reader is supposed to interpret the text on the basis of the associations that he makes with the society in which he reads the text. The context, that would be either political, social, or moral, that is to be associated with the messages and meanings of those deviant features or foregrounded features, and then they are to be backed up with the same evidence that he finds in the text with the help of some other features that correspond with those. Jeffrey Leach also says that there is a third way or a third mode of making interpretations of foregrounded features. Now, first one was that it might not be intentional. First one was that it might be a mistake of or error of typing and writing, which does not really count for or call for interpretation. The second one was that a writer deliberately makes use of foregrounding or makes use of a symbol or a metaphor and wants the reader to interpret it, like a grifago, or like anything that is something like a symbol of ivory, or related to politics or morals of the society or the time in which the writer was living. So he, in a very covered or ambiguous a manner, wants to highlight those things which he cannot openly address. So when a writer is presenting something in a hidden way, we read it through interpretation and assign meaning to it. So third instance is when any feature that is deviant or foregrounded is judged by the reader to be significant. The writers believe in this third interpretation or the third mode of interpretation, that neither the creator of the text nor somebody else can assign meanings to text. The only person in authority of a text and its interpretation and understanding is the reader itself. So the significance of the text lies in the reader's mind. The reader comes to the writing with a set of beliefs experiences, and they put those beliefs and experiences at work when they interpret text. And it is the reader's knowledge that enhances the meaning of any foregrounded feature. It is the reader's experiences that give meaning to the foregrounded features. So, while reading, we as a reader focus on many things: the literal meaning of the symbols and the objects, the metaphoric meanings, between the line meanings, referential meaning, connotational meaning, emotive meaning. So, the meaning that the writer has presented might not be that expanded, but it is the reader's imagination that expands and elaborates and interprets those foregrounded and deviant features which the writer has used for the sake of giving an exercise of the mind to the reader. So, what words and details suggest something or something more than literal, and which meanings are intended by the author, that becomes the job of the reader. So, the reader has got full liberty until or unless he justifies those associations that he has made with an object or a symbol or a metaphor. His interpretation and analysis are complete and correct. But these understandings and analysis must have a connection with the overall scheme, pattern, and design of the work. It should correspond with what else has been said in the text by the author. For the sake of understanding these three examples of interpretation, in which we looked at the fact that the first example or the first instance says that interpretation of those features which are errors, mistakes of typing, proofreading, or even mistake of utterance because of speaker's lack of knowledge or his not being a native speaker of a language. These instances do not count as deviations or artistic deviations. Artistic deviation is what has deliberately been employed by a writer, like the use of a symbol, for example, ivory, the use of the phrase a grief ago, for example, the use of the symbol of the knife or the empty bucket. We looked at those images earlier. So these are deliberate because they are associated with the themes the poets are conveying or the writers are conveying in their text. Then another way is to interpret the text is to look at it from the perspective of the reader. The reader becomes important. The reader becomes the maker of meaning. The reader is in charge. The writer had laid bare before the reader the whole domain of meaning, and he is adding meaning to the foreground features on the basis of his previous knowledge and experience. I, living in my society, would read a text written in the English society in the way I receive it. My experiences are not the same as that of an English reader, but I read the same text by an English author and interpret it in the way or in the society in which I live. So my interpretation of the foreground features would be embedded or be aided by the background experiences that I have in my society. Similarly, if we come across any piece of writing, we look at it from the perspective of the fact where we observe things from. Where are we located in the text, and what is our relationship with the text? That is what would determine the interpretation and meaning of the foregrounded features. Observe this example by T.S. Eliot. These examples are from his famous poems, one The Hollow Man, and the other is the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Look at the first example from the poem Hollow Man by T.S. Eliot, in which Eliot says, "We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw." Now, observe these lines for the sake of interpretation of the foregrounded features. Here the writer has made use of a collective pronoun, that is we. We do not know who he is referring to. We is used either for the maybe professional people, the working class, the upper class, the middle class, or maybe we is reference to humanity at large, we is reference to the post-war generation of Europe maybe. So we give meaning to these words, that we is maybe the family itself, that the poet belongs to, the character belongs to, the speaker belongs to. Then the hollow men. Hollow men as if dead, as if skeletons, and stuffed men having nothing within, a substance, a spirit, blood or flesh. Stuffed something, we stuff something that is hollow. We hollow out anything that is made up of wood and then stuff it with maybe anything that we make it with. For example, if a rag doll is made up of cloth, we stuff it with maybe a sort of cotton or foam. So if something is hollow, it means that it has nothing within and it needs to be filled. Then leaning together, leaning, not standing together, leaning as if something is falling. It needs a sort of, you can say, aid to stand erect, but leans together, something that is unconscious. For example, when you are sleepy, you just recline, your head bows. So the image of leaning together, things like as if that is not the human beings but corpses that are dying or lay dying. Headpiece filled with straw. Now he's not saying mind filled with straw, headpiece, because they are reduced to pieces, separate entities. Now head is filled with straw as if it is stuffed, as if it is empty. There is no thought, there is no spirituality, there is no mind, there is no intelligence, there is no, you can say, understanding. So this is the interpretation that we make on the basis of the fact that the poem was written in the post-war scenario in Europe, when everything was falling apart, everything was getting down to ashes and bits and pieces because of the materialistic pursuits, because of the lack of the understanding of religion and their distance from the spirituality and the teachings of God. So if this is the context of the poem, the poet has perceived people living or inhabiting the today's world as hollow, like dummies, like skeletons, like rag dolls. So our interpretation is aided by the fact that the image which is foregrounded is that of a hollow man, is that of a stuffed man. So the foregrounded feature of the poem becomes the image of an effigy or a scarecrow or any rag doll that is made for the sake of entertainment only, that doesn't really live a life, that is almost, animate, or you can say it's dead. Look at the second example, that is from the same poet's another poem, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Let us see its foregrounded features and its interpretation. When the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Now just two lines have been picked. And look how these lines are packed with the foregrounded features and are worth interpretation. The poet is making an analogy between the evening, that is foggy, hazy and grey, and a patient who is unconscious, who has been given some kind of sedative and who has been etherized or has been given anesthesia. Now look at this analogy, how it foregrounds the state of the man, the condition of the modern man. That modern man is unconscious as if he is given anesthesia. He's not alive, he's not conscious. And it is what is reflected in the evening as well. Evening becomes hazy, dusty, foggy, misty, unclear. Now this comes to the foreground, that the evening's haze and the haze in the consciousness and mind of the modern man are blurring their understanding of the reality. In a hazy evening you cannot see clearly, and the man who is etherized cannot think clearly. Now this analogy foregrounds the reality of humanity in the modern life. So we interpret it against the very background that how the time that is of evening that is of, something when the light is fading, the light of sun is fading, and at the evening when it becomes a bit chilly and cold, how it makes us numb, just the way an etherized patient who has been given anesthesia has been losing consciousness and feeling cold as if dead. That is the beauty of foregrounding, or any irregularity that is done with the help of metaphors, analogies, similes, or symbols or images. This is what these features perform in a text. When we observe literary texts, especially poems, there are many things that complement the foregrounding. Words, images, rhythms, symbols, they are all closely associated with interpretation. And to study the words, their placement, their arrangement, their composition, the way they are arranged, how they act and react, how they function within the close proximity. Now their way of reacting and acting upon other words is clear from the last example that we looked at, that how the etherized patient and the hazy evening are complementing each other. Now they act and react and enhance each other's meanings and clarify each other's significance and relationship too. So this is how it becomes really necessary for the foregrounded features to be interpreted, because these do not stand out alone. They stand and gain strength with the help of the rest of the material that lies within the poem. Words in any literary writing have their significance beyond their literal meaning. That is one thing that you must be sure about if you are to use it for the sake of interpretation and for the sake of the understanding of the foregrounding. So in literary writing, we always take words in their non-literal sense. They also have emotional, associative, symbolic significance. And when we look at its associative meaning, we have to apply a close and very, you can say, vigorous skill of the application of the feature of interpretation. And only the application of the skill of interpretation would bring the meanings out. It would help us in deciphering the total meaning, the overall meaning, and the broader meaning of a text, and it would make the context of the poem and the understanding clear to the reader. Observe these few examples which say, "My aunt suffers from terrible arthritis." Now, we have heard the word arthritis, that is a disease, but never before did we come across the word arthritis. Now, in our interpretation of this foregrounded feature, which seems to be a mixture of two words, author and arthritis. Now here, maybe the writer seems to be saying that the aunt is obsessed with the writing so much that it has become a disease like arthritis. So instead of saying that the aunt has a disease of writing, he says the aunt suffers from terrible arthritis. Now the arthritis is a novelty, a deviation, and hence it becomes prominent, and for the reader it is worth a scrutiny, it is worth interpreting. Then the second example says, "Like you plays." When we read this example for the sake of interpretation, we find that maybe the writer or the speaker doesn't know English well. So instead of saying, "Do you like plays?" he says, "Like you plays." So our understanding is that the speaker has lack of knowledge or understanding of the language. Then in the third example, House of Commons, that is written as How of Commons. This we interpret as a typing error. So we have seen in these three examples what we looked at interpretation from the angle of deliberate, done by the author himself, mistake committed in the proofreading and typing, and then interpretation to be understood from the perspective of the reader, who would assign meanings to anything that is unclear and ambiguous. So we conclude that Jeffrey Leach has termed that a deviation is significant, or any foregrounded feature is significant and worth interpretation when it is deliberate and artistic. And We may further say that not only whether deviation has a sensible interpretation, but whatever interpretation is to be given, that has to be subjective because it is coming from the reader. But to avoid the subjectivity, what we are to do as a reader, we have to find its association with the rest of the images, with the rest of the objects and ideas presented in the text. Only then we can remove or avoid the element of subjectivity while we are interpreting the foregrounded features or deviations in a text. So in our discussion for today, in which we discussed the importance of foregrounding and how foregrounding demands interpretation and what are the ways and possible means of interpreting any foregrounded feature or irregularity and deviation. We concluded with a saying by Jeffrey Leach, who in A Linguistic Guide to Poetry says, "Linguistics and literary criticism, insofar as they deal with poetic language, are complementary, not competing activities, where to meet is above all the study of foregrounding." So, for the sake of the study of the meaning of the foregrounded features, Jeffrey Leach says that there is no competition going on between linguistics and literature. Rather, linguistics and stylistics, the understanding of the form of the language and the understanding of the meaning of the language, is to be reached at through a cooperation between the linguistics and the literary critics' understanding and analysis of a text. So it proves that if stylistics is a domain or a feature or a technique which studies the meaning of works, when we say that the meaning of texts cannot be understood without the study of the features and style of text, this is what Jeffrey Leach also backs up, that a linguist and a literary critic, they both cooperate, and the knowledge of both the fields is utilized side by side for the sake of interpretation and analysis of the meaning as well as the understanding of the foregrounded features. This brings us to the end of today's topic, that was the importance of interpretation for foregrounding. Thank you.